My name is Kelly McFall, and I teach history at Newman University. I want to welcome you to the fall edition of the History Department Speaker Series. This happens every semester, and we'll have another one in the winter if you're interested. You can become a member of or you can follow the Newman University Humanities Facebook page, where we provide updates about all of the speakers in the humanities area. So that's the winter. But today, we're really lucky to have with us one of the preeminent historians in new military history of the 21st century, and that's Beth Bailey. And the way this works for you, those of you who have never been to a talk or never had to introduce a talk, is that you print out what's called a CV, which is a fancy word for a resume. And you steal ideas from the CV about how to introduce somebody. And so I printed off Beth's CV, and I ran down the hall to the printer, and I thought, surely by the time I got there, it would be done. And I stood at the printer, and I stood at the printer, and I stood at the printer. And this is her CV. Wow. And I thought, there's no possible way I can actually introduce her and leave her time to speak while I'm going to really review her CV. So here I will just say, Beth Bailey comes to us from Kansas, the University of Kansas, where she recently accepted a position as a Foundation Distinguished Professor. She is the author of several books. Her most recent one is titled America's Army Making the All-Volunteer Force. But it says something about her breadth of interest that her first books were called From Front Porch to Back Seat, Courtship in 20th Century America, and her second book, or another book, Sex in the Heartland, which is about Lawrence, as I understand it. And so she has an interest in gender studies and the history of sexuality, but she also has become a military historian, looking at the military both through the lens of gender studies and sexuality, but also much more broadly thinking about how the military and military institutions interact with the broader society. So she is going to talk to us today about a talk titled Black, White, or Green, the U.S. Army and the Problem of Race in the Vietnam Era and Beyond. She'll talk for 40, 45 minutes, something like that, and then we'll get a chance to pepper her with questions. So be thinking as you listen. And so I will get off stage so you can see the person you would like to see. So, Beth Bailey.
Is this microphone working? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for that really generous introduction. And I also want to thank the students who met with me this afternoon. I had a really nice time talking with them. And thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a great crowd, and I'm thrilled to be here. So, Black, White, or Green, the U.S. Army and the, quote, problem of race in the Vietnam era and beyond. Let me begin with the proposition. We can't understand the history of race and gender relations in the modern United States without thinking about the role of the U.S. military. Now, military leaders have steadfastly insisted that the military is not the proper place for what they tend to call social experimentation. The military's mission is national defense, not trying to remedy the social ills of the nation. Nonetheless, willingly or not, and it was more often than not willingly, the American military has had to try to manage the effects of social change. And so from the late 1960s forward, the U.S. military was forced to confront, perhaps more directly than any other major American institution, the impact of the 60s legacies of social change movements. Civil rights, women's rights, youth questioning of authority. So right now, I started working on a new book about how the Army tried to manage what it frequently called the problem of race when it was going through the difficulties and crises of the Vietnam era and over the decades that followed, so roughly 1965 to 1985. The story I'm telling is not the heroic narrative of men and women who were fighting for equal rights and social justice. though those men and women are part of this larger story. But instead, what I'm trying to understand is how this huge, major institution in American society tried to contend with a key crisis of the age. How does social change actually happen? What forces social change? Social change, in this case, originates certainly in the struggles and the protests and the demands of those people who were being discriminated against. But the point is that those demands are never the end point. They're never successful in and of themselves. Change has to be enacted into law. Change has to be created in the larger social context. Change may demand amendments to the Constitution. Change has to be managed through the institutions of people's daily lives. American workplaces, American schools and universities, American media. And in this case, it has to be managed through the U.S. military. So instead of telling this heroic story, because there are others who have told it very well, I'm going to offer a different version. It's not only the heroic acts that are involved. Oppression and discrimination existed undeniably, but often the story was not simply the clean story of people rising up against the evil oppressors and having a conflict and a winner being declared. There are people who are acting. They're good people, they're bad people, they're mainly just people somewhere in between, in a period that was incredibly tumultuous. A period where there was an enormous amount of social disruption and social anger and violence. So the story that I'm going to tell tries to acknowledge all of that struggle and tries to confront what I see really as the historical complexity of the problems that these institutions had to manage and that those who were fighting for change had to confront as they thought about how to make the change that they so desired actually happen. So let me start with a bit of context. There. It's an era of uprisings and racial violence, of riots and rebellions. It's a time when disillusioned black youth embraced movements for separation and for cultural nationalism. In this context, the claims of rights and the resistance to those claims didn't end when men and women put on military uniforms. Racial conflict that existed in the broader society intensified as large numbers of young men, many of them very, very much against their will, were inducted into the military during the time of a very, very unpopular war in Vietnam. Now, lots of these young men of all races and ethnicities, were from poorer working class backgrounds, and lots of these young men had very little experience in talking to or in living with people from different backgrounds than their own. And these young men in the military were forced together in an environment that required integration of racial groups that went far beyond the workplace or the classroom or even the neighborhood. They had to eat together, they had to sleep in the same room, they had to train together, they had to rely on one another. Let me offer what is perhaps a drastic understatement. It wasn't always going so very well. Racial violence exploded on military installations during the late 1960s and the early 1970s. On the continental US and in Germany, Okinawa, Korea, the Republic of Vietnam, all too often spilling over into the streets surrounding the coast in the towns and cities. And as these stories of conflict, both of discriminations against African Americans and of racial violence, often in these cases of blacks against whites, reached beyond the boundaries of the military, there was an enormous amount of public outrage and political pressure to solve this problem of race. The NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Urban League, all get involved, and it becomes a frequent story in America's national media. Now, these external pressures matter a lot. And some military officers felt a sense of moral commitment to change this crisis. There were very few senior black officers. so those black officers were not usually in a position to make a great deal of change. But more significantly in this case, military leaders and strategic planners saw the problem of race as critically important and as demanding their full attention and extraordinary resources, because they were afraid that racial conflict and the internal stresses that it was fostering undermined combat readiness, and thus the mission of the U.S. Army to defend the security of the nation. So in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, as the U.S. military is fighting in Vietnam in a war that it would not win, at a time when escalating Cold War tensions and the growing instability in the Middle East was making worse an already volatile and dangerous strategic environment, if racial conflict undermined the combat readiness of the U.S. military, it was unacceptable. Moral considerations aside, conditions of fairness aside, if it undermined combat readiness, it was unacceptable. So, the Army has to manage the problem of race. Some people messed up badly. Some people acted in bad faith. But overall, the Army as an institution approached what it saw as a crisis with a surprising amount of imagination and creativity, and some of it paid off pretty well. Army officers and leaders investigated the relationships between race and military justice and incarceration in ways that presaged some of the conversations we're having in contemporary America today. They pioneered in race-conscious promotion and affirmative action. Some of this really was very well-grounded. On the other hand, some of it, like much else from that era, was just kind of plain weird. How many of you saw that last episode of Mad Men? Anyone? This isn't going to work then. They embraced self-actualization and personal realization programs, often without training people to lead them, which created all sorts of really weird things happening. But they also did what I'm focusing on here tonight. The Army, as an institution, rejected colorblindness. It took a highly race-conscious approach, which was a big shift. And in so doing, it focused on questions of cultural symbols and cultural identity. That's somewhere, I think, between the good and the weird. But it suggests a set of larger questions about the relationship between the military and American society. Okay. Long preface about what I'm up to. Now I'm going to really start in on what I wanted to tell you about. Long preface. Okay. In the late summer of 1969, the same month that the Manson family worked their evil on Cielo Avenue, murdering Sharon Tate and her unborn child, and Jimi Hendrix offered up the Star-Spangled Banner in the final set at Woodstock. The Assistant Secretary of the Army sent a young attorney named John Kester off to Fort Riley here in Kansas. Now, Kester was relatively young. He was 31. He was smart. Army leaders figured for some reason that young soldiers might be willing to talk to him. Now, Kester's job was to try and assess the state of race relations in the U.S. Army on local armed posts. And what Kester came back to report was not exactly what he had expected, and certainly not what his superiors had expected. He said time and again, members of both races, because there are only two, said that what they were really concerned about was hair. Right. Now, what is quite strange about this is that the leaders of the Army took this terribly seriously, that men were worried about hair and hair tone. Why in the world, if you're worried about race relations in the Army, do you take this topic seriously? Okay. Because at that enormously conflicted moment in American history, the problem of race fell near the top of the problem of military changes. So even as what people were calling the light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam grew dimmer and anti-war protesters were massing in the streets, the Secretary of the Army speaks to the Association of the U.S. Army soon after Kessler comes back from Fort Riley, and he's talking about the key issues that he thinks it's important for the Army to confront. not surprisingly, what do you think he begins with? Vietnam. He assures people in the late summer of 1969 that, in fact, time is on our side and we're going to win. That out of the way, having reassured everyone, he decides he's going to devote the rest of a very long speech to the problem of race in the Army. He starts with the usual disclaimer. He says, we're not in the business of social reform. But he says the problem of race is something that the Army's going to have to confront. He tries to explain the problem as he sees it. He puts the issue in a broader context of social change. It's not our fault, basically, is what he's saying. As society has changed, he said, so have the attitudes, abilities, and needs of the young men who enter the Army. And this is the Secretary of the Army talking, he says. The Negro, in particular, is different from his counterpart of 10 years ago. Formerly, he countered acts of racial discrimination with only hard work and endurance. Today, he is more likely to make his resentment known. Today, in the young black soldier, there often is more personal and racial pride or bitterness at real or imagined injustice. Now, no matter what we might read into the Secretary of the Army's use of the term Negro well after most people in the United States had stopped using it, he actually was taking a fairly progressive stance on race, as you'll see in a little bit. But he's not alone. William Westmoreland, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army, also ordered an assessment of racial tension in the United States in 1969, and that led to a big conference about race relations in the United States in November 1970. They bring together key Army officers, they bring together people who are doing research on the topic, and they start talking about the actions they've taken and what they think that they might do to solve the problem. They concluded after about 4 days of intensive conversation that the problem really isn't the Army's fault, but on some level, even if it has its origins in American history and the broader American society, it doesn't matter where it comes from, the Army's going to have to deal with it. They said racial conflict is a problem which the Army must acknowledge and respond to in order to continue to remain an effective combat force. Okay, again, to remain an effective combat force. In their terms, the stakes couldn't be higher. Racial conflict could lessen our ability to defend the nation. So, therefore, because the stakes were so high, these high-ranking military officers were willing to put themselves on the line, to expend resources, to try and think creatively, to come up with a solution to the problem. And many of the leaders, white leaders here, embraced a race-conscious approach. They rejected the notion that we are all the same. Doesn't matter the color of our skins. This is a big deal. Senior leadership in the Army in the early 1970s adopts a race-conscious approach. And so the Secretary of the Army did a survey, a random sample of 650 surveys in March of 1970, and found that 21% of the soldiers at Fort Carson thought that hair was the biggest problem they faced. It's 1970. The Vietnam War is going on. There are tanks shortly before that in the streets of Chicago. They're worried about their hair. 63% of soldiers listed haircuts in their top 4 concerns. Okay, so they said, all right, if it matters so much, well, hair. Okay, hair. Why do people care about hair? Okay, there are different reasons. 63% of the soldiers at Fort Carson were not African American. About 11% were. So obviously it is both races that are concerned about hair. But for black young men, in an era of cultural nationalism, as many men and women started to claim a distinct black identity, the visible symbols of that identity were really important. As Kester, the young man who was sent off to Fort Riley, noted in his memo, he said, to black soldiers, the Afro style is a mark of self-confidence and pride. Black power, black nationalism, black pride, black is beautiful. The importance of no longer trying to look white, to conform to white standards of beauty. In this world, hair mattered a lot. It was a visible symbol of identity and of cultural pride. so the Army starts trying to figure out how to address the demands of black soldiers who say that the afro is a critically important symbol of their identity as proud black men, and find themselves facing barbers who are white guys from the Army who have absolutely no clue in the world about how to cut black hair, who go into PXs and find the shelves stocked with things to make your shiny, fly-away hair not be so fly-away. They start looking for an expert on black hairstyles and cutting black hair, and in a sort of another weird thing the Army did, they sent observers around the country to watch Negro customers and see what they bought in stores, so that they could then give a list to the PX about what they needed to stock, which actually was quite good, because they said, we need to stock Ebony magazine, you need to stock Jet magazine, you need to stock this kind of shampoo, you need to stock this kind of cosmetics. You know, it actually worked. And they hire a guy, his name is Willie Morrow, who was a barber out in California. He was from San Diego. He's the one who claims to have invented the Afro pick and then later the Jerry curl. And they sent him on a tour all over the world to teach people how to cut afros. And so here he is. He's in Tokyo showing a group of Japanese, not very happy-looking barbers and beauticians how to cut hair. And in Seoul, Willie Morrow gives an interview to the Pacific Stars and Stripes, and he says, the black soldier today wants his blackness recognized, and I am here to be part of that recognition. So over the 3 years from 1970 to 1973, the Army spends what is the rough equivalent of about $750,000 today to teach barbers how to cut afros. And they also create a new magazine called Curly Cues that is about black hairstyles. Oddly enough, hair still is a point of conflict. So the Congressional Black Caucus, which was formed shortly before that period to advocate for the interests of African Americans, members of Congress, held a set of hearings on racism in the military in October of 1972. And Wallace Terry, who you might have heard of, he's the author of Bloods, he had been the former bureau chief of Time magazine in Saigon, and he testified to this set of hearings that the Black Caucus had. It's covered the worst for 2 years in Vietnam. And they asked him, what are the complaints of soldiers in Vietnam, of black soldiers in particular in Vietnam? And as he listed them, they were in order: slow promotion, assignments of the more difficult and dangerous tasks, and then number 3, the question of hair, and number 4, the question of music. He said there was not, if blacks can account for up to 22% of the dying, they should have at least 22% of the jukebox or the music on the armed forces radios. So it was not just hair, but a whole series of symbols and consumer choices that people cared about. Now, soldiers weren't only interested in those consumer goods, they were interested in ways to express black pride and to clearly signal that to all concerned. And so in addition to embracing the notion of wearing at least a modified afro, there were other methods of signaling black unity that were developed during the Vietnam War. There we go. Dapping. How many of you know what dapping is? Okay. Dapping is an extended form of handshaking. That the term comes originally supposedly from the terms dignity and pride, but it was a way of expressing black identity and solidarity. So you see here two soldiers who are beginning the process of dapping with one another. This is another specialist who is the chairman of the Unsatisfied Black Soldier, who is dapping. And this is a piece of art that was created by hand to photograph the whole process of a very extended dap. Now, black soldiers would often do this as a way to express solidarity, to greet one another, to show they were on each other's side, but they would also do things like getting in line in the mess hall and go through an extended period of dapping with one another, and so hold up the line so that everybody else had to wait for them. as a way of claiming space and making a point. But dabbing was something that many black service members thought that all black service members owed one another. This is going to get complicated, right? Because all black service members are not all privates. Yeah? Okay. The other thing, we get black power salutes to substitute for the traditional salute. We get soul bands or unity bands, slave bracelets, brotherhood bracelets that people wore. The Army is going to struggle over these symbols because such symbols of group identity are by nature in conflict with the signs of military identity and the primacy of that identity. I mean, they wear uniforms, right? Those symbols of group identity conflict with the logic of the military. Order, hierarchy, rank, consistent policies across the board. Okay, so does the sergeant dab with the privates? This is a problem. But because improving race relations was defined as such an important priority, and because African American soldiers in general were concerned about a great many things, but they took quite seriously the issue of cultural symbolism. The Army leaders, by and large, started loosening restrictions here. General Davison, who is the commander-in-chief of U.S. Army Europe, says that their goal is to totally integrate the Army and make African American soldiers genuinely feel part of it and proud of it. But he says these processes, black power salutes, dapping, afro haircuts, black bracelets, etc., they show a need to belong where one feels accepted, and they are something that we are not going to think of as anti-establishment. If African American soldiers need this, this is because we are failing them, and we are not going to punish them through this. Now, that doesn't mean that it'll always trickle down to enforcement. There was a lot of problems about enforcement. But as the Army starts to try and figure out how to make this work, it starts to develop policies that allow for, quote, culturally oriented items. All right. Here's where it gets more complicated. The problem of race provides the justification, but the problem is going to stretch a long way between afros and slave bracelets, and the problem of hair is going to stretch beyond the afro style. Militaries depend on policies and regulations. Those regulations are laid out in often excruciating detail. They're subject to enforcement, and they're meant to be universally applicable. So if the Army decides, for example, to recognize the importance of black identity and accept the use of various cultural symbols, it can't limit the use of cultural symbols to African Americans alone. So when the Army decides to start accepting the use of cultural symbols of black identity, it opens the door to a whole variety of claims about identity and expression that went well beyond its original intent. Right? If one group's cultural symbols are acceptable, why isn't another group's? Where's the line drawn? If black soldiers can express pride in black identity as they interpret it, can white soldiers, or maybe white Southern soldiers, express pride in their identity as they interpret it? As a cultural symbol, the Confederate flag did not improve race relations in the Army. And what the Army officers eventually did was to ban the display of any flag that was not either the United States flag or the Union flag as a way to try and handle the problem. But they still opened up a kind of can of worms. Their impulse was to validate the cultural identity of those people who had been marginalized and oppressed, but because it is an institution that relies on regulations across the board, there was no way to simply say it's okay for African Americans to do this, it's not okay for white men to do this too. Fairly frequently, what you see, though, are Army officers treating the two as if they are perfectly parallel and interchangeable. So that race relations conference I told you about earlier in the thing, they in their concluding comments, they said, white soldiers often misunderstand black soldiers' use of symbols and tend to see them as threats, even when that's not the intent. The next sentence read, the display of the Confederate flag and the use of racial epithets by white soldiers are equally offensive to black soldiers. Wait, equally offensive? Fort Carson responded to a survey about the use of cultural symbols, and they said, here there are no restrictions on black unity bracelets or the display of Confederate flags. They're both cultural symbols. Okay. This is clearly something that will exacerbate racial tension. Clearly not what it's designed to accomplish. But what happens when the identities are identities that aren't purposely defined as racial or as confrontational? What about young men, white men, who want to belong to youth culture, to counterculture, who want to be cool or hip? It's the Beatles, right? They're not in the Army. Hair had an awful lot of significance for men, black, white, and other. And while for black men, hair was held to signal black masculinity and black pride, for a lot of white young men, hair was also a sign of masculinity and of belonging, not to the military, but to youth culture or to counterculture. Kester, the young man who went off to Fort Riley, he said that commanders don't seem to understand that their men also want to look handsome, but they understand that differently. So he says the commander sees the soldier after a haircut and says, there, he looks so much better. And he said the soldier looks in the mirror and says, I have been defaced. Now, this was not funny at the time. This was just, you know, a haircut, a fairly conservative haircut. Soldiers say they want to look the part of men as they conceive men to be. It becomes a huge issue in the reserves, because in the reserves, people serve 1 weekend a month. What happens when somebody who is in the reserves has a job that depends on passing for somebody who is hip or cool? I mean, I'm a music promoter, and I've got a semi-shaved head, which was not hip or cool back then. They eventually decided that they would let people wear short wigs for training. And there were suits all over the place asking, why can't soldiers wear wigs to hide their long hair, so when they go off post, it won't be clear that they're soldiers. All right. Hair policy is going to take on more significance by 1973 when the military ends the draft and moves to the all-volunteer force, because beginning in 1973, they can't conscript people, they have to convince people to join the military. Couldn't rely on the draft. It had to appeal to youth, it had to convince them to enlist, and so if hair mattered to young men, no matter race, no matter ethnicity, it had to matter to the Army. So, we hear more about how you think and how you cut your hair. This recruiting ad was, developed to try and draw you into the Army, and it turns out that in fact it wasn't so, because on hair policy, but the ad had already been printed and distributed. So they had to issue a kind of explanation of the circular. So the Army says the advertisement was designed to appeal to young men in the 17 to 21-year-old age group who might be considering military service. The photograph represents an individual from the group. It does not illustrate a soldier meeting the standards set by the Army. Nonetheless, they tried. Okay. Hair during the 1970s, given all of the incredible struggles that were going on in the nation, absorbed an enormous amount of military time and attention. The struggles over hair reached from the lowliest private to the chief of staff of the military and the secretary of the Army. They commanded the resources and attention of the NAACP, the ACLU, and the Department of Defense. They led to courts martial. They were the subject of federal court decisions and brought before the Supreme Court. They bedeviled NCOs and members of Congress alike. And the Army attention to hair policy borders on the absurd. We start in 1967 with the appearance and conduct. 3-paragraph, no specific mention here. April 1968, 37 words on hair. December 1969, they get into the length of sideburns and mustaches, and they also start not just talking about length, but about bulk, because they're trying to figure out about how to measure the length of an afro, because you don't necessarily pull the hair strand. Constantly revised. A commander in one area published his own interpretation of Army regulations, and it goes like this: sideburns will reach no lower than the line from the lateral palpebral commissure of the eye to the tragus of the ear. Do you have any idea what that means? Okay. Implementation was complex, and here led to lots of cases of discipline. The reason that people got court-martialed for having long hair was not because their hair was long, but because they refused to obey a lawful order. There were a series of court-martial cases, the first of which, the chart showing acceptable hairstyle here. The first case was an airman named August Doyle, who was court-martialed at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico in October of 1969 for that haircut, which within several weeks, the regulations of the Air Force let him wear it. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they decided not to hear it. By 1974, with a whole variety of cases about hair, court-martials over hair in the news, 2 representatives from the U.S. Congress got involved, Les Aspen and Patricia Schroeder. And what they did was to, this is, guy was being court-martialed for that haircut. They threatened a congressional investigation. And Congressman Aspen in a press release said, apparently the Army is willing to jeopardize our military readiness in Europe over a silly issue like the length of a man's hair. That's incredibly stupid, even for the Army. At which point the Army articulated the proper relationship of the servicemen to civilian society to determine where the line should be drawn between the military world and the civilian world, and actually what they can enforce in terms of that line. To what extent must a soldier's identity be first and last military? So the Army leaders were willing, at least for a stretch of time, to accept elements of cultural expression. A kind of juxtaposition a historian named Michael Kramer has called fifth militarism. But as hair policy becomes tied less and less to, quote, the problem of race, and becomes something that is more a broad set of claims by a diverse group of people, often having nothing to do with the problems of racial tension in the Army, tolerance begins to decrease. And Army leaders start to insist that the Army, the military, is an exceptional institution. You've heard a lot of talk about American exceptionalism. The Army is an exceptional institution. And the Supreme Court validated that set of claims. What does that mean in this case? Key, first of all, is that the military is distinct from civilian society. The template for letters that were sent into complaints about hair policy says the Army is a separate and unique society. And that was supported by federal court cases. Second, military exceptionalism is based on the role of the military and its mission in defending the nation. The notion is that that justifies the restriction of certain rights of soldiers, if that's important to fulfill the mission. The military says this is an issue of order and discipline. And if maintaining order and discipline requires constraining some individual rights, like self-expression through hairstyle, that's acceptable because of military exceptionalism. And third, members of the Army, they say, must maintain a soldierly image, meeting the expectations of a broader American society, and signaling through their appearance that they are disciplined, orderly, and strong. A policy statement said, while individuality in a soldier is desirable, the Army can't abandon those standards required to preserve the image of an Army designed to protect and represent American society as a whole, which translates into freedom. Now, The response, as I'm closing up, to the Army's claim of exceptionalism, to the Army's claim that there must be an absolute dividing line between military and civilian society, that it is important to draw that distinction and to maintain order and discipline, is to question that division and its implications. And the claims that are made here are high stakes. A sergeant writes to Representative Schroeder, he says, as long as the Army forces its personnel to conform to 1950s hairstyles, it will effectively cut off personnel from participation in the civilian community. History has shown us, it's always good to end with a lesson from history, history has shown us the danger of the military losing contact with the civilian community. And just in case you don't follow exactly what he was talking about, Lieutenant Matthew Carroll, the guy with the Army hat and long hair, as he's facing court-martial, sends a petition to the U.S. Congress identifying himself as a citizen soldier and saying the only reason the brass attempts to maintain this separation between civilian society and the military through hair policy is to separate us from our civilian brothers and sisters in order someday to make easier massacres such as Jackson State and Kent State. Now, in the end, the issue of hair is solved by changing fashion. None of you look like those guys. The Army offers a kind of bounded individuality, relaxes some regulations, and as hairstyles become less extreme, they no longer conflict, and in fact, short hair becomes fashionable eventually. And finally, there's a legal challenge from a police department, and the Supreme Court rules that the police can regulate hair, and it's seen as parallel to the Army, so that's all over. Nonetheless, hair at that moment in American history did matter greatly to an awful lot of American young people, black, white, and other ethnicities. That moment passed. But the broader issues that hair symbolized, the questions of conflicting identities, the relationship between the military and civilian society, the implications of separation between the two, and the relative importance of notions of military exceptionalism continue to be debated today, just not about here. Thank you.
Once it became an all-volunteer army in the early 70s, it seemed like this selection could have taken care of a lot of those problems, but they also needed the numbers, so they couldn't be all of that selected and say, no, if you're not willing to do this, we're not going to take you because they needed you.
Yes.
And so that was kind of an interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. They were trying to recruit between 20 and 30,000 people a month in 1973, and when the Army was really in bad shape. They were struggling to recruit 60 to 80,000 people a year recently. So they weren't turning a whole lot of people away unless they were incapable of serving. Hair was not going to do it. So it was going to wait for other changes to take place. Yeah, it's a really good point.
When you were talking about outward symbols of cultural identity, I was wondering if you came across tattoos that were particularly associated with groups of African Americans versus in the military.
Tattoos became a different issue later. And at that point, there were regulations that said that tattoos could not show past the extent of the uniform. The tattoo, I remember, this shows you how old I am, I remember giving a lecture in New York City where I was teaching about the weird practice of tattooing. And how we probably don't think this way anymore, but people were seeking some permanent way of marking their body, and in today's fast-changing world, tattooing has become less popular. A year later, suddenly everybody in that room would have had a tattoo. But that wasn't an issue. But various services have been reconsidering their policy on tattoos because they're so common, and they're not going to turn away well-qualified, committed people because they have a tattoo that might show beyond the border, right? So that did become later an important issue. Tattoo, any kind of symbol that created, that were like, white supremacy symbols and things like that, that gets dealt with differently. But, the run-of-the-mill young people tattoos were common. Yes?
You talk quite a bit about hairstyles. What about beards and mustaches? Is that ever considered to be also the regulations and?
And when the type got too little for you to read,
Yeah.
a lot of that was about beards and mustaches. And it was amazing. I don't know how many of you remember how strange some of the facial hair in the 1970s was. There are sites that will show the best beards in the Civil War era, where you can see where it looks like there must be birds nesting in some. The mutton chop sideburns in the 1970s could probably host whole families of birds. And they were very concerned about explaining exactly how that could be handled. The other issue was for some African American men, shaving was a problem because of folliculitis, and then men would get written up because they weren't shaving properly, and so they had to get doctor's notes, and sometimes their commanders or supervisors would not recognize the doctor's notes as legitimate. All of this that existed in policy was implemented, and the implementation was inconsistent and not always of goodwill. And so what's complicated in trying to trace all of this is that I'm looking at the ways in which the Army as an institution is trying to function, but I'm also trying to find how it affected individuals on the ground and how it was implemented, and there's often a gap there. Sometimes it's a good gap, and sometimes it's a bad gap, but there was an awful lot of inconsistency in the administration of policy, especially about things like facial. And you should go and look at the pictures from the 1970s. Don't Google it, it's fun. Somebody?
Do you see parallels between the integration of African American culture and later on the incorporation of more women into the military? What sort of compromises the military had to make for females? I mean, obviously hair would be a very charged issue for females as well.
Well, there was a recent struggle in the Army where I think I got a slide. What was it? Oh, one second. I get back to it. I'm sorry, I'm not finding it. A couple of years ago, black women were complaining because the Army regulations about hairstyles were framed in such a way that it created a great deal of difficulty in terms of hairstyles that were practical for them in the field, ruling out a lot of styles, and that was protested. In terms of integrating women, the question is often quite different. I mean, and again, women were treated as race as well. And so African American women are heavily overrepresented in proportion to the population in the Army. But in the 1970s, the story about trying to bring more women to fill the ranks because they needed people was often a really weird mixture of talking about traditional female strengths. Women, the Secretary of the Army said it's really wonderful to have more women in the Army because they bring with them such charm. As they're advertising some of our best men are women, which was a progressive kind of model. They're trying to get women to fix trucks, but they're advertising you can meet a man and get married. So there was a lot of back and forth kind of confusion about how do we do this. So the discussions around men and race and cultural identity seem fairly straightforward compared to some of the weird mixed signals that were going on about women, including a lot of nasty stuff being said about their sexual behaviors by people in the broader society. Yeah.
You showed a photo of the Beatles in your presentation, so I was wondering if you could explain the effects they had on the issue of hair.
Well, that's a whole book. It's a had a powerful effect on the ways in which people style themselves. And you know, you look back to Clark Gable taking off his shirt in a movie and showing he wasn't wearing an undershirt, and all of a sudden there's sales of undershirts in the United States on it. The Beatles came when they were sort of called mop tops, when their hair was a lot shorter than that. And you know, there were high schools and around the country creating regulations that no Beatle haircuts would be allowed. Parents were having meetings to talk about the crisis of long hair. But you know, these were symbols of youth culture. They had a powerful impact on the way in which people wanted to look. And when you look over the years at the different ways that people style themselves, it's amazing how quickly sometimes our ideas of what looks good changes, and a lot of times it's tied closely to figures, you know, such as the Beatles or other popular
Do you guys
musicians.
remember pants that were really, really falling down all the time? Do they remember that? Is that so long ago? Yeah, sometimes people style that way. We can see the briefs really watch that. You don't do that anymore, not the ones that they. But I respected your market.
It's more complicated than your mind. You sometimes have to pick fights in order not to have the real fight. You're not going out of the house dressed like that.
I think it's the yuppies that got rid of the long hair. Sorry.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you mentioned in your presentation about African Americans and then Chicanos, so Mexican Americans, but did you come across anything about Native Americans? Because there's a strong tradition of them in the military.
The Army as an institution kept saying they're interested in the problem of race, and then they would talk about a variety of racial ethnic groups, and then it went right back to black-white. Every once in a while out west, there's conversation, and the word that they used was Chicanos, which had the political impact. But it tended to disappear. And that's one of the things I'm interested in, is thinking about the ways in which the Army as an institution was conceiving of the notion of race, because, and I'm trying to treat white people as race instead of treating it as the issue of race is about African Americans. But I was really shocked by how it collapsed. You asked about Native Americans. There was a publication called, I've forgotten the name of it. There was a publication that was meant to embrace the diversity of the Army, and it was published by a variety of soldiers of color. And there were people who would write about Native American issues in it. That's the only place that I found it. And I'm still looking, but I'm not really thinking like that. Partly because there didn't seem to be an issue at that moment. Anyone else? Yes.
So was there much like solidarity between white soldiers that wanted more freedom in their hair and African American soldiers that were trying to have restrictions maybe loosened or more accommodation?
There was a lot of separatism at that moment, and certainly in individual cases, and especially in Vietnam, out in the front, people did form close relationships. Where you would see something like that, where you would find black and white soldiers creating solidarity about hair policy, was often in what were called rap groups, which meant something quite different back then, that were set up to have conversations at the different posts, and they would say, okay, here is a policy, here, this is what we propose. But there was, again, what it tended to do instead is to complain about one another. So the white soldiers would say, it's not fair, black soldiers are getting to have afros, and that, you know, they can pass in civilian society, and it's just not fair. And the black soldiers saying, it's not fair, the white soldiers are getting to have long hair, and that they're, you know, being too hard on us, and largely people were smiling at each other. Not a great model for social change.
And then was a lot of the disciplinary actions, was that mostly being taken stateside, or were there units in Vietnam that were actually prosecuting black soldiers?
I mean, again, the prosecution often, it was for not obeying lawful order, and again, there's a lot of discretion there about what was called out as improper hair. that was one of the things that African American soldiers often pointed to as a way to say, look, there is discriminatory action being taken because there's so much latitude, and this officer, this commander, is constantly disciplining black soldiers because he's prejudiced. So there was a lot of concern about the ways in which the non-judicial punishment was functioning during this period, which is the more serious set of stories here. I mean, hair mattered because people thought it mattered, but there were a lot of really serious, difficult things going on that this is the lighter way to talk about some of it.
So you made the point earlier that the Army recognized this as a problem and intentionally moved to address it. I'm wondering.
Because I don't think that those claims, we're not seeing hair as the source of claims here. But somebody could convince me with evidence that there is some kind of causal link or connection. I just don't really see it. It's an interesting set of juxtapositions that I think about.
You mentioned briefly the issue of music. And how big of an issue was that for the African American soldiers? Because I imagine they were particularly interested in listening to something like Motown or, oh gosh, it's voting me in a moment. And white soldiers were generally more oriented towards white groups like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones.
Actually more for country.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so music was a huge issue. Music was a huge issue because the Army or the military brought in performers and entertainers, and they tended to be much more likely to bring in white performers and entertainers. There was a lot of conflict over who got to control the jukebox in different places. Different groups would bring in portable players to play music, and there'd be fights between different groups because it was about claiming the space. And the PX was very concerned about making sure that it had music that met the needs and desires of the whole, panoply of people that were there. But, music was often sparked conflict, sometimes racial violence, over the decision about music, and black and white troops often frequented different bars because of senses of separatism and a sense of belonging, but also because of the kind of music that was being played and the ways in which that was used to frame their larger sense of identity. So all of these cultural pieces mattered. It's not that cultural pieces don't matter today, but this was a moment when the claims were very straightforward, and the Army said, what are we going to do about this? Today, I think they're much more willing to sort of say, okay, bring. Is that it? Oh, sorry.
I'm just wondering, I was reflecting on your slide of the Fort Hood soldiers and kind of rebellious type of stance. I'm wondering, was there ever any suggestion of that African Americans in the military rebellion as like, we're not going to let what happened in the Civil War happen to us, where the black soldiers were so denigrated, even though they performed beautifully?
Well, there were certainly black service members who said we're being given the more dangerous assignments. We are the casualty rates, the death rates for African American infantrymen were very high early in the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of talk about purposeful genocide. And so that was one of the complications when we moved to an all-volunteer force, is that African Americans were enlisting at high rates, in part because limited civilian opportunities. But they were highly disproportionately represented in the Army and the Marines, but in non-technical positions, meaning often frontline combat troops. And on the one hand, there was a great deal of concern that if there should be a war, there will be a highly disproportionate death rate, because if you're represented in high numbers, you're going to die in high numbers. But as the Marines and the Army started trying to say, we have too many black men in the military, black leaders like Rondello said, here you are trying to close off the path of opportunity to us again. And both are completely understandable sets of claims. There were also a lot of people who were looking at the level of rebellion and racial violence in the country and saying, for reasons that were probably tinged with white supremacy, it's dangerous to have so many black men go off and be trained in weapons use, given the upheavals that are going on in the country. And so there were conversations between black officers about the use of African American troops in civil disturbances in the U.S. and whether or not that was a legitimate thing to ask them to do. So those conversations did happen.
So, I think I can do this without a mic. I want to say thank you again for coming. I want to invite you to pay attention and come back in the winter for our next speaker. And I want to invite you once again to say thanks to Professor Bailey.